Hello and welcome to the Labor John podcast. Today we have one very special guest with us. But first I'm going to introduce my good friend Gabe Christie. Gabe Christie, how are you doing, Gabe Christie?
I'm doing good. How are you?
I'm doing good, Gabe Christie. And would you like to introduce our lovely guest?
Now that you've said my name like 16 times, sure. We're joined tonight by Will Caverly. If you'd like to introduce yourself, Will.
Sure. I am an independent author. I live in Chester County, PA, and I'm just happy to be here. Love your podcast. Love everything Philly history generally, but I like the focus that you guys do. So really happy to be here.
Oh, thank you.
Oh, very flattered.
Of course.
So
let's end it there.
Yep, that was a great podcast.
We can't beat it.
Let's wrap it.
So you've written a book, and would you like to share the title and give a brief little synopsis of it before we get into the nitty-gritty?
Before we get into it, it's Tinicum Eastwick, and the subtitle is Environmental Justice and Racial Injustice in Southwest Philadelphia. And I would say like the elevator pitch is that this is a story of two grassroots movements that grew out of a 1950s urban renewal project or urban redevelopment project, or probably more accurate, a quote unquote slum clearing project. I think the best place to start the story is the late 1940s. As you guys probably know, Philadelphia had been run by a Republican administration since the Civil War, maybe, like going back a really long time. There was a sea change going on in the late 1940s, early 1950s in Philly, where there's sort of a rising Democrat Party at work. They were aggressively campaigning against the corruption by the Republican administration. The Samuels administration was the last one. And particularly two players, Joe Clark and Richardson Dilworth of Dilworth Park, were out there trying to just turn over this Republican administration, and succeeded. There were a lot of changes made as the Democrats came in. They were sort of riding on Truman's coattails, where Truman had surprised everybody by actually winning re-election. They changed the nature of the civil service in Philly. There was a new city charter that the Democrats were leading. They included all kinds of great reforms and no more patronage. And I think they went with a strong mayor form of government, all this great stuff. There was one project that did not change with the change of administrations and this like complete dismantlement of the Republican machine. And that was a grand plan. It was a grand plan of urban renewal or urban redevelopment for the southwest of the city. And the grand plan was this: we are going to redo the neighborhood down there, and we'll get into nomenclature, but we're going to call it Eastwick. We're going to redo this area of the city and make it a new city within a city that will be the size of Williamsport or Lancaster, like an industrial hub.
Okay.
And the story starts in the 1950s, where folks like Ed Bacon, Kevin Bacon's dad, of course, and the famous. So I'm like 6 degrees of separation with Kevin Bacon. Like I am getting closer and closer every day. Ed Bacon, among others, especially a gentleman named Bill Rafsky, aggressively pursued this project, and it included not only ripping down the neighborhood of Eastwick, some 2,400 dwellings and buildings, but also filling in the marsh that was next to that. And the marsh, Tinicum Marsh, used to be basically all of Southwest Philly used to be marsh until farmers started to drain it out. Irish farmers, the Swedes in particular, started to drain it out. This little bit of marsh was the last of a very valuable bird habitat. So you had two parts of this project. Let's rip down this neighborhood and let's drain this marsh and fill it in with dirt. And we're going to have this awesome city. And these two grassroots movements arose in opposition, one to save the homes of people and one to save the homes of birds.
Go
and
birds.
That's where Yeah, I almost called the book For the Birds, but that was too flippant because this this story is it's a triumph, it's a tragedy. You have like in the title says, you have an environmental justice concern where you had a major win for the nascent environmental movement, and you had a major loss for the people of Philadelphia.
Again, what was Eastwick in the 40s? Like, what did that area look like? What were the demographics?
So Eastwick was a really fascinating area of the city. It was semi-rural, I would call it. Lots of freestanding homes, so it was not ruled by the row homes that the rest of Philly is kind of known for. So lots of farming essentially going on. You had a lot of people gardening, but you had people, stabling horses. Some of the pictures you look at is like open meadows for as far as the eye can see in some places. And that was what it was valued for. The people who went down there knew that they could get a home that was, a single family home down there, and that it would be affordable. And the demographics were fascinating. This was an integrated neighborhood in an era that wasn't particularly known for integrated neighborhoods. It was one of the few in the city that you could probably say was integrated, according to what I've found. About 40% black, 50% to 55% white, and then you had you even had some Asian immigrants, a whole mix of people who were in there. Of course, a lot of Polish and Italian immigrants, but you had a very strong Jewish contingent there, including several synagogues were down in that area. Very interesting from the perspective of folks living there who, said coming up, I talked to a lot of people who were kids at the time, since the adults at this point have passed away. But many of them said, they were going to the integrated Wolf School down there, the elementary, I guess it was elementary up to high school.
Okay.
And they were saying, like, my teacher was Irish, I was black. Like, it wasn't something I thought about. There was a Jewish dentist in there. There was a black doctor who treated white patients. I mean, you're talking like very naturally integrated. There was no quotas. I call it gentle integration here. Like you're talking about just people who ended up next to each other. And one guy said maybe it's because we could all spread out, like that it worked for us. Like we all had our own homes, and it was really nice and spacious down there. Well, the city didn't see it that way, as you can imagine. City of Philadelphia was not that enthusiastic about it.
What?
It was called a slum. There was like racially charged language about it, as you can imagine. And because of this perception, it was ripe for this urban renewal, urban redevelopment. I should note, and of particular concern to this podcast, is this was a very working class area. The folks down there usually worked in industry in Delaware County, like Westinghouse, or some of their, I don't think the refineries had been built yet, but they had been employed at the Hog Island shipyards during World War I, like all that kind of stuff. Like, these people were working class, worked in industry around there, and in the end, were blindsided, I think, by the city's plans. So the city of Philadelphia was not too happy with how it looked, and had targeted it all along with, I don't know, 6 to 8 other areas of the city, places that I'm sure you also know have been redeveloped. West Philly, Black Bottom, West Philly. There was a lot of it done up in North Philly, particularly to like encourage industry.
I was just bringing up the lovely Philadelphia redlining map, and Eastwick is solidly red.
I'll put that aside for just a second for dramatic tension, and talk a little bit about the environmentalist conservation movement that was working at the same time. So in the early 1950s, as this project was being planned, and some of the plans were getting press and getting circulated around City Hall, a group of Chestnut Hill residents, who, as you can imagine, are upper class white, really got concerned that they were going to lose this marsh habitat that was on the Atlantic Flyway, home to a lot of rare birds. There's not much freshwater tidal marsh around at this point, and it's really the last freshwater tidal marsh in the Philadelphia area, which means the ocean actually pushes in and goes back out with the tides in this area. And as a result, these well-to-do conservationists started to press against it, and they, unlike the folks in Eastwick, had connections in City Hall with Joseph Clark's administration, and even potentially with Gulf Oil, who actually owned part of this area along with the Redevelopment Authority, since, again, this was a very heavy industry area. And they also partnered with the Birding Association, Delaware Valley Ornithological Club, and essentially was an effort of birders. A bunch of people who just like to stand around with binoculars and look at birds all got together and said, like, we're going to save this part of the marsh. And when I say that they're close together, like, these are adjacent. I mean, there were people who in Eastwick who hunted and fished in the marsh. There was a lot of people who used this for subsistence. I mean, you're talking about people who, if they could save any money, that's how they would do it, by dragging fish out of there. And just to get to the working class element here, I mean, these people would run along the Reading Railroad and picking up coal from like coal cars that were coming through during the Depression just to keep their house warm.
Jeez.
One gentleman I talked to, his father would always say, we have a coal stove in this house, even though there's plenty of people with electric ranges and things like that. We have a coal stove in this house because you could always burn the furniture if you have to.
Damn.
Just to give you an idea of the folks down there. So they lived off the marsh, and like they valued it as a habitat. And then these folks from Chestnut Hill, the highest point in the city, I might add, were also concerned. And what happened was, through a flurry of activity, they were able to get the redevelopment plans to create a bird sanctuary and a municipal park out of that part of the marsh. And the latter half of my book deals with more modern stuff. But what you should know is that the Tinicum Wildlife Preserve was a municipal park created in the 50s. And you had folks who were resisting the redevelopment in Eastwick saying things like Elmwood, which they was another name for this Eastwick area. It really is for the birds, because you're watching this park get put up next door, and all these city resources get poured into putting in roads and observatories and things like that. And the book is really about the juxtaposition of these. I hadn't really found any work that talked about like the environmental dimension of the Eastwick area. And since you guys are into labor history and things like things like that, it really reminded me of. Are you familiar with Poliani? I think it's Carl Poliani.
No.
So he worked for the OECD and was an interesting like anthropologist, economist. He wrote a book called The Great Transformation. David Graeber, if you're familiar, David Graeber, really loved him. And R.I.P. David Graeber. I couldn't believe we lost him. But so his book, The Great Transformation, Poliani's book, The Great Transformation, deals with what he calls fictitious commodities. And one of the things he says is a fictitious commodity is the land, because how can you commodify something from which all economic activity is derived? How can you commodify these areas? And it really, this story is the story of Philadelphia being carved up and decisions made about the land, and the working class people finding it really difficult to carve out their own home, and the priority here put on in saving the environment and conservation.
When we were having audio troubles, you were going into a little bit of kind of it sounded like red baiting from both directions, both from the city and from the from the people, or from the citizens of Eastwick. and that one Penn professor.
Dolores Rebello, who was the 27-year-old leader of this entire resistance in Eastwick, stormed down to the FBI headquarters in August of 1957 as this was really kicking off, and said that she had evidence that there was a communist conspiracy behind the redevelopment effort. And it was...
I love that.
What isn't a communist conspiracy?
Especially in 1957.
Yeah.
Yes. So it was one of the things I write in the book about is how like McCarthyism was a little bit stale at that point. Everybody was kind of over it, and it didn't have the cachet it used to. But she went down to FBI headquarters and said she had a potential link between a communist sympathizer who is Louis Mumford, who is like associated with the City Planning Commission, and Penn, and that he, because he was a communist sympathizer, this was therefore a communist project. It didn't go anywhere. The FBI, I even did a FOIA request to see if I could find anything about her claims, and they said they came up with nothing under her name. So I really don't think it went anywhere. But there were plenty of bomb threats and arson threats against the Redevelopment Authority along the way. So City Hall was furious, saying, this is ridiculous. You can't threaten to blow up City Council. It's not appropriate. And
no comment.
Right. Yeah, exactly. And it was a shame that all these things get thrown around, but everybody was desperate. I think that's what it comes down to. The folks, talking with some of the kids who lived there at the time, the one guy's become a lawyer since down in South Carolina, and he said like one environmental impact study today would have stopped this entire project.
Wow.
Because my book delves into the what's happening today in Eastwick, which is flooding. Flooding is a major concern because unfortunately the redevelopment of Eastwick that happened did not work out as expected. Many of the people whose homes were torn down, they never put anything on top of those homes. If you look at a redevelopment map versus the street map of today, there's huge swaths of Eastwick that are just bare. They're just woods at this point, and that has a lot of people very upset. As you can imagine, they're like, I can't believe we watched our home get torn down and then nothing built there.
Right.
One of the homes torn down, I believe, was Patty LaBelle's. She grew up there, and she went to Beulah Baptist Church. It was the first place she had ever sung a solo. And her old home and Beulah Baptist Church itself were both torn down. You had a lot of black churches torn down. There's black churches claiming that they were sparing the Catholic Church in the neighborhood and not sparing the black churches. And you started to have this kind of infighting going on. And I fast forwarded a little bit too fast here, but the upshot is that City Council voted to tear the neighborhood down, and that's what happened. You had one gentleman I talked to. He was like one step ahead of the Redevelopment Authority. He moved, I want to say 3 times. Every time he moved within Eastwick, his family moved within Eastwick, they were being evicted, being told like this building's going to be turned down. He ended up in West Philly, and he said, he said it was a culture shock. He said, I didn't know there were gangs and, things like this. I didn't know there was this kind of urban violence because I didn't grow up with it. I'd never seen this before. Mm-hmm. He specifically said it looked like the Blitz or something, what they did to the neighborhood. Damn. And what the shame of it is that this has been written about. WHYY has covered some of it. Inquirer has covered some of it, but it really has been a story that's behind a paywall, in the sense that like there are academic articles written about it, but you can't get to them without, a license to the academic journals and things like that. And it was geographically the largest redevelopment project in the country. There were larger ones by population that Robert Moses undertook in New York, but in terms of acre by acre, this was the largest one in the country.
the population numbers were smaller, probably just because it was a more spread out population.
That's right. Yep.
So
Exactly. It was, they kicked out the people and their horses and their chickens and all the other things that made the area unique were all driven out.
What got you interested in this story? And like, because clearly you've kind of fallen down a rabbit hole.
Yeah.
And
fell into a marsh.
Yeah. How did you end up on this path?
Yeah, it's a great question. And it's one of those things that you just sort of stumble on. I had done my own history podcast called the Tinderbox Podcast, and it didn't have much of a theme except anything I was interested in. And I started researching the land trusts in the Philadelphia area. And if you're familiar with land trusts, they are organizations that like save farms and prevent farms from being turned into Toll Brothers and Pulte developments and things like that. Mm-hmm. They also operate parks. And I started looking into natural lands, which is really the largest one in the Philly area. Well, it turned out that they are descended from that conservation group that had battled for the marsh. And
interesting.
60 years passed, and I ended up finding the founder's daughter and talking with her about her dad, he was a fascinating guy. He was an accountant. He ran in the Chestnut Hill circles, but he like owned two tweed jackets, and like one for summer, one for winter. Like that's just the kind of guy he was. And she told me about, some of what had happened. And I knew that this was an interesting story of the land trust, but I didn't feel like it had much of a hook. I'm looking for, I'm out there looking for a story that has a better hook. Well, I sort of stumbled on the idea that there was this redevelopment going on that had been there to destroy, had been planning to destroy the marsh. Found out this connection and then started running with it. And the publisher had reached out to me and said, do you have any ideas? I said, yes. And this was an idea I wasn't going to pursue without a publisher. And the stars aligned, and I ended up running with the story for 4 years now, something like that, 5 years now.
Wow.
Yeah. And, these things change you. I lived in Delaware County for a little while, so I was sort of familiar with the Southwest. I had friends in Upper Darby, so I was like familiar with it, but yeah, I didn't know any of this history. I didn't grow up in Philadelphia. This was all news to me too.
That's one thing that we keep finding on this podcast is that there's like random little bits of Philly history that are fascinating, and no one would ever know about them unless you know someone who was there.
Yeah. I don't know if it's because Philly is like the forgotten city, the forgotten major city of the United States. It seems like that to me sometimes. Like everybody loves New York's history, even LA history, because it's so short. It's easy to digest. But Philly's an old city and has all these layers, right?
We're too complicated.
Too complicated. I mean, I was looking at the early history of Southwest Philly, and it was the Swedes were in there, and the Swedish governor was this guy John Printz, Printz, and he was like this alcoholic psychopath who was he hated everybody. He hated the Swedes that were part of his colony. He hated Native Americans. He hated the English. He just hated everybody, and was like executing people, and just he ended up going back to Sweden, having failed the colony, and these. And that's like 1600s or so, that's ancient history as far as Philadelphia goes. But, I live near the Swedish cabin, which was this little cabin on the Darby Creek that's still there to this day. And you can go down there and look at it. They do a Christmas thing. I mean, Philly just has these layers that, they're hard to untangle. And yeah, what can you say? We're complicated. We're a situation in ourselves.
I'd never thought to describe Philly as like an onion, but now I think I have.
Well, I will say, one of the things that the book deals with too is garbage, and this might be an interesting thing for you guys.
Wait, why would it be interesting for us?
No particular reason. just
Garbage.
the streaming platform. No,
There you go.
Kidding, of course. Dilworth, when he was mayor in the late 1950s, banned open air dumps and insisted they were going to use incinerators to get rid of trash. And they started to people started to ship the garbage out of Philly to surrounding counties, like just get it over the county line and then put it in the dump there.
Jeez.
Well, if it wasn't bad enough, if it wasn't bad enough for the residents of Eastwick to, have their homes blown up and be evicted, and then also for this wildlife refuge down there to be, next to all this heavy industry and getting polluted, these dumps came in and essentially just are leaching and continuing to leach forever chemicals, disgusting stuff into these neighborhoods, which really creates a horrible thing when the floodwaters start to rise, as you get like just awful soup in people's homes. But yeah, the remarkable story with that was, and it just kind of goes to show you like that the working class people down there didn't quite know how to handle this. The one girl went out for a walk. I think her name was Kathy, and taking a walk in the green space, kind of over close to the dump on the Cobbs Creek, and she comes back home holding a monkey.
What?
And yes, and her family's like, "What?" She's like, "Yeah, well, there's more monkeys up there." And it was forever known as Monkey Mountain, this particular dump, because somebody Penn. No, I don't know. Some lab had dumped a bunch of monkeys in this lab. I honestly don't know who has done it. Don't sue me. But they just had no idea where these came from, and it's just a pile of dead monkeys. And
Jesus.
The people who are appealing to the authorities, to the Pennsylvania Department of Natural Resources, they have no clout. They have no lawyers on their side. There wasn't a lawyer that lived in Eastwick, right? They didn't have like an attorney who did a practice there. These aren't people who have wills, these aren't people who have the ability to put together legal arguments. So, yeah, it was kind of dismaying to read all these things. And what I have found so far is a gratitude from people for recording the story. I didn't feel like the story was mine, but I'm just hoping it moves the needle on helping people today with flooding, with that long tail of issues that come with redevelopment, the devastation that happens to people's families and they may not recover from for generations. I just hope it can at least get that story out there. The book is written for a non-academic audience, so I can recommend it to people without them being like, "Holy shit, this is boring." I do try to make it into a bit of a thriller, but it is very much a history book grounded in history and grounded in the research I did. So
you're mentioning of like the industrial world that was around Eastwick. I'm just looking on a modern map, but just to give listeners some context, immediately across the Darby Creek to the west of Eastwick, there's an oil refinery. On the western side, or on the west side of Eastwick, on the east bank of the Schuylkill, there's an oil refinery. On the west bank of the Schuylkill, there's one of the oldest oil refineries in the United States, which is no longer there because it exploded.
Yeah.
And then in addition to all of the industry that was around there, and they're also pretty much right under the flight path of the Philadelphia International Airport.
This is an area that's just all kinds of activity, and then you have this incredible bird habitat right next door to it. Kind of wild, but the airport's expansion essentially went into that redevelopment area as they sort of failed to get industry and homes built. Yeah, just give it to the airport. And actually, that
Sounds
young
right.
woman who was made all the communist accusations, there's one record of her in Mindy Fulolov's book Root Shock, which is great about the long-term effects of urban redevelopment. Dolores Rubillo, 27 years old when she led the resistance movement that failed, still lived there for the rest of her life. She never gave up her home. The city also never took it away from them on purpose. Not the Philadelphia Mother of the Year, not the ringleader of the resistance, which you have to wonder if they did that on purpose. Like, we don't want to be in the papers rounding these particular people up. Anyway, she lived there for the rest of her life, and her house is now the Hertz rental car lot down there. After she died, it flipped back over to the city, and then became redeveloped. So
that sounds right.
Good for her.
Yeah.
Good for her memory.
I guess. It's weird. I get sort of inoculated to the horrible things that happened because you're just reading one horrible thing after another.
Yep.
And you guys being labor historians, that's all it is.
We're familiar with that.
Yeah, I don't. You have to have that dark sense of humor, and you have to have Sam's, color commentary going on, to help you. Otherwise, you'd lose your mind, right? Reading this kind of stuff.
Thank you for sharing this story with us.
Yeah.
Happy to hear anybody's comments on it. I guess if you have any listeners in Southwest who may have had a family member involved with this, I'm always happy to hear stories too.